closer, getting closer. Spot is start to change, things look a little strange as we get closer. Closer, growing closer. No need to be afraid, our troubles start to fade as we get closer. Together is a word we must learn to understand. We ever want to get to know each other better. Together is a word that holds tomorrow in its hand. Tomorrow's just another day to get together and get closer, closer, The earth's a big blue marble when you see it from a...
So it's all going to be downhill after that. But anyway, just to welcome everybody and to introduce Laura, who's going to be the MC of her own show, I think. And also just to say how much I love this book. And it comes as the opposite of a surprise because, I don't know, in a world full of kind of thoughtless people, and it seems to be the number of thoughtless people is on the increase, there are a few very thoughtful people around, not just thoughtful, but very thoughtful, and I think Laura is one of those. And so she has a very almost quiet way of thinking through a question, and she's also kind of marathon runner, so these thoughts go through a long period of time, and the book is some kind of registration of projects that have been going for a long time and have been thinking through. And of course the other thing is that very, very thoughtful people are by definition revolutionary. Simply the very act of thinking about one question for a very long time is a transgressive act, particularly in this moment of the planet, etc., etc. So it's of course not by accident that this book that comes so quietly and so strongly but so patiently is actually a book whose emergence exactly parallels the movement of ideas about, for example, data visualization from a very peripheral and even long distance perspective within the architectural field to being at the very epicenter of the field. And for me it has been personally a pleasure to have known Laura both when this stuff was seemed to be about as far away from architecture as one could possibly get, to today when it's almost frighteningly the opposite, that it's almost the more naturally understood dimension of architecture. And so we start to, as it were, see architecture through the lens of visualization as distinct from. So visualization itself has moved from coming after architecture to being before it, which is why, of course, the title, Close Up at a Distance, is so sort of brilliant and unbeatable. And the great thing about an unbeatable title is it really doesn't matter what's in the book, because the title is still sort of doing its work. So I think the real challenge to Laura was simply to make a book that was as good as its title, and I think it's even better than the title. And I think it's just, I couldn't be happier. It's like a great thing. Also, just to put in a plug for books in general, so one way to do it is to make arguments about books and so on. Another is just to point to a book. I would point to Laura's book as a reason why books are still a really, really good idea. So I'm very proud that Laura is a colleague of mine here at the school. I'm very proud of the fact that she has, for those of us who come to America from a very long way away, it's very, very satisfying to see this kind of revolution, this quiet revolution being literally carried out in front of my eyes. And I think generations come out of this, new generations, and they will in a certain way try to overturn and revolutionize Laura's work, but it's not going to be easy to do that. It's really not going to be that easy. This book's not going to go away. So, Laura Kurgan, and great book.
Thanks, Mark, for a lot of different things. But so I should start by talking about the fact that the book is there, and to remind if there are some students in the room, that the book might not have happened. I was very good at backing things up as the book went along, and sort of converted things from floppy disks to jazz drives to zip disks to CDs to the cloud, which is where it lives now. But I wasn't so good at updating the programs that I used to make the images. And as I was doing the book, and Julie was waiting for images day by day, it actually became more and more difficult to translate a lot of the images. So I caution everyone, and the fact that that I had the book to make me do that, I might have lost a lot of the work. So I do think books are, in the end, really important as an archive, although my work lives in so many different places and has had so many different platforms as most of us who work in digital formats, as happens to us. So anyway, I'm here to introduce Trevor Paglen, and we're gonna have a conversation. So we're gonna really try and have a conversation about the book. We're not really gonna go through linear. I've got some images from the book, and as Trevor asks me questions, I'm gonna sort of flip in between them. But I'm really honored to have Trevor converse with me. He's an amazing artist in and of his own right, and has actually done many books, from his dissertation in geography called Black Sites. It's Black Sites, right? Blank spots on the map. Blank spots on the map, which are a lot of black sites as well. And often when he does projects, books come out of it, and the most recent one is about, it's called The Last 100 Pictures, where he selected 100 pictures and embedded them in a gold plate and launched it with a satellite into space as part of the preservation of these images for the future, for whoever will find them. And I find this just the most magical project. So he refuses to show any of his own work today, which might disappoint some who are here. But I've embedded a few there secretly anyway, so you can try point them out. So thanks, Trevor.
Super. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for such a warm introduction, Laura. We just wanted to structure this as sort of more a conversation and talk about some of the issues that your work raises and that the book in particular raises. I'm hoping we can just take a look at the Earthrise image to begin.
Which one this time? Let's start with the standard one.
How about
okay.
Whatever one you like.
Yeah.
You can do the Jesus one.
That one.
Okay. So these images, a lot of historians have pointed out that these are some of the most reproduced images on Earth, by far, and they somehow speak to the moment that we're living in. These are images that have become synonymous with the environmental movement on one hand, the lower. Actually, I think both of these images have been on the front of the whole Earth catalog, for example. And they perhaps speak to something that is actually new about the historical moment that we're living in, which is the point of view of being off the planet, kind of becoming a normal part of our everyday lives, whether that's through images like this, or whether that's through the fact we're using Google Maps or Google Satellite View or whatever it is. But it's a view that in my everyday life I use probably a dozen times a day, and that really wasn't possible before these kinds of images started to get produced. So I wonder if you could just talk about these images. You begin your book with these images. Are these important?
Okay, that's a good way to start the conversation. But actually, neither of these images are on the front page of the Whole Earth catalog. So, and we'll go. So I'll actually take you through a number of them. So, the reason that I start the book with these two photographs is that they're photographs. They're taken from out of space, but they're photographs. They're not satellite images, which a lot of the book sort of tries to go into. And so, as you pointed out in your fabulous the review that you wrote of the book, that what's his name?
Bill Anders.
Bill, yeah. Bill, yeah. So this image is Bill Anders takes credit for having taken. He was one of the Apollo 8 astronauts, and this is the way that he frames the picture on his wall, according to Trevor, who saw it, which completely changes that orientation of standing on the moon, taking the picture. It's more the view of being in orbit and looking far out into space, in fact, to other universes, which I'm becoming more interested in nowadays. And then this photograph, it's another photograph which was taken by an astronaut on Apollo 17, which is one of the most reproduced photos of Earth from space, and again, a photograph which has been absorbed by the environmentalists as the blue marble floating in space, vulnerable. You can't see, but vulnerable on the one hand, but on the other hand, it erases boundaries and borders between countries and peoples, and so that's the movie that we showed that Gavin found. Gavin watched it as in the 70s wherever he is. I actually had never seen it, but so the next thing I found was this button, which was actually made by Stuart Brand in 1967, and he rode a bicycle all the way across the country, demanding that NASA show a picture of the whole Earth, which he hadn't, which he claimed was there, but that the government was still classifying. And so the image that's on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog, which is from this, is actually based on this movie. Oops, is it showing? Hold on. Okay, it's a silent movie, so we can talk while it's going. So, which is from a NASA spacecraft, or you could say one of the first satellites. And I don't actually know why it was classified, but it's an amazing. You can see sort of the passage of day and night. Then they overlay the grid of longitude and latitude onto it. They even show various weather patterns like typhoons and cyclones. So what happened was that later this satellite became declassified and resulted in that image on the Whole Earth catalog in 1968. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's that's the photograph. But what I became interested in is the new generation blue marble, mm-hmm. which when you look at your iPhone, it's the same. Actually, the 2002 blue marble is the same image that's on your iPhone. And this is not a photograph now, right? So it's from the MODIS satellite. It's at a resolution of 1 kilometer per pixel, and it's a composite, and it's made out of 4 images taken one every 3 months. And the question is, why did they leave the clouds? And I think they left the clouds to remind, to make it look as similar as the blue marble from 1972. And in fact, people still do get it because they don't really know what image they're looking at on their iPhone. In 2005, NASA produced a new blue marble. This time, it's a composite of every month. Actually, it's a flat view of the whole globe. And what they did was they decided to produce this as an image which had no clouds. So now 1 kilometer per pixel, and you can actually use it as the background of a lot of different maps. And again, in 2012, although you can use this image actually with and without clouds, there's now 2 different options. But again, it's a composite image taken over a series of months. So,
but the advent of these images from space, showing the whole Earth, in the kind of popular imagination, these are environmental images. They're kind of a reminder of that we're living on a small, fragile world. But not everybody saw them that way, right? I mean, and this is something you talk about in the first chapter, that these are in fact very conflicted images, perhaps.
Yeah.
And you want to talk a little bit about how perhaps that easy read of them being these kind of environmentalist icons can be complicated a little bit.
Well, they can be complicated in lots of different ways. So the way that I've chosen to complicate them really in the book is through the history and declassification of satellite satellite imagery, in the way that they're pixelated. They're made of technologies which are often military, have military origins, and I kind of flip back and forth between trying to understand them as a technological viewpoint and a technological way of viewing the world, but on the other hand, as a new way of viewing the world, which we have to take on. There's no way that we cannot take on, because there's so many of these images being produced. If we don't claim them for ourselves and figure out innovative and creative ways of using them, then then they only remain for the so-called, bad reasons.
Well, let's go there. Why don't we pull up an image of a kind of classic overhead aerial image of the kind that we're that you look at kind of and address kind of extensively.
Like this one?
Yeah, pull up that one, for example. So this is a photograph from a U-2 spy plane taken over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, it's a kind of one of the kind of canonical case studies of the use of overhead imaging to do a certain kind of political work. Now, a lot of people, of course, not a handful of people kind of before you have really published about this phenomena of overhead seeing. And generally, the consensus has been quite critical of these kinds of viewpoints. For someone like Lisa Parks, for example, who points out that these are highly ideological images, in the sense that here we have an image that is, in fact, very, very fragmented. It reveals, it's very ambiguous. I mean, these are very, very abstract images. Even here, they has to be labeled to say what the different things are that you are seeing. I mean, it's an image that somebody has to interpret for you, in other words, to mean anything at all. However, the aesthetics of the image is one of objectivity. So you have an image that on one hand is extremely ambiguous as to what it is, and at the same time, carries this kind of aesthetic force of nothing could be more objective kind of thing to it. So that on one hand, and then there's other people that are very just worried about whether or not this viewpoint is itself kind of irredeemably tainted by the military origins of these kinds of seeing. And that's really I think is one of the big things that you're proposing in your book, is to kind of move beyond that paradigm.
Yeah.
of seeing satellite images with or seeing overhead imagery with. I wonder if you could kind of talk about that,
Yeah.
that question of ambiguity and
Right.
this kind of aesthetics of objectivity or whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it.
Well, I actually think it's really important to go beyond that supposed image of objectivity, and mostly because, and in some ways you could call the book a prehistory of Google Earth, where now overhead and satellite imagery have become so naturalized as images of truth, right? Especially in situations of conflict, for example. So someone like Lisa Parks, who to her credit has written one of the first overviews of a history of satellites as a media trope. Yeah. She did that really well. But she talks about Srebrenica, for example, and spends a long time talking about how these are military images. They prop up a military point of view. They are there to deceive. And then she talks about David Rode, and this is actually David Rode talking at the Columbia Journalism School, who took this image, and this image of the...
What do you mean he took this image?
He took this image which had been published in the Christian Science Monitor, and it was one of the few images that were allowed to be published, although the rest, a lot of other images of this series were still classified. So, for example, Madeleine Albright showed this image to the UN Security Council as evidence, of the before and after of the massacre in Srebrenica. But what's very important to Lisa Parks is that David Rode went there. He was the only journalist who went to check up on the fact that this had happened. And he, of course, did incredible investigative reporting, wrote a great book about all of it. But in the end, what she was more interested in was going there herself, because she felt, even that wasn't enough, that the interpretations of these photos were still military. And when she actually goes there, she talks about how she's blinded herself to what she can see because there's actually no evidence. There is actually no evidence left in what she's looking about, and the people in the village are all trying to steer her away from the site. So what she thinks as, going there and seeing with your own eyes can be as blurry a vision as these satellite images are themselves, So when Colin Powell...
let's before we go to Colin Powell, so,
okay.
I think one of what I thought was a really kind of profound point in your book was saying that it's precisely because of the fact that these images need to be interpreted kind of so vigorously that's where the kind of opportunity lies for them to be appropriated towards different kinds of uses.
Yeah, but well, there's two sides of that, because the one has to do with image literacy and with teaching people how to read these images, right? Because most people who use Google Earth don't even know that the imagery they're using was classified just 12 years ago. So that's number one. Number two, they don't know that there's a limit to that image in terms of its resolution, and we don't even know whether Google Earth allows you to get to the full resolution of a high-resolution satellite image. But on the other hand, yes, the images are ambiguous and therefore can be interpreted by both Colin Powell and me, and any other, human rights organization or the opposite. So, so that really does make it almost our responsibility to try and understand how these images are made, what the limits, what limits are embedded within them, and what potential uses, what kind of ecologies they produce.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, in the popular imagination, there's this idea that technology is neutral, right? That images are that satellites don't, kill people kill people, or whatever it is. So I just want to push you a little bit in terms of that. Someone like Karen Kaplan, for example, has argued that we really need to understand the fact that these images are produced through a particular military point of view. These are images that are produced for targeting purposes and reconnaissance purposes. And kind of, so I just want to push you a little bit in terms of what do you think there are limits to the ways in which these might be reclaimed or done other things with? And I mean that just kind of theoretically. We can kind of go to some examples of them as well.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, there are very few. The reason why these are not neutral images, so to speak, is if you talk about them as images, then you're already negating what they are, because they're not images. They're infrastructure. They come out of an infrastructure which is built to constantly take pictures of the Earth from far away. So if you're talking about a high resolution image, for example, you're talking about someone who has sent the satellite to look for something. Targets aside, right? Actually, a lot of these surveillance images are not used for targeting; they're just used for looking, right, and for searching, and not for much else. Which is why they're so prevalent. Actually, I think the secrets now lie in other places. we can talk about that later. But but on the other hand, here are these two images, and this is kind of a sad picture in light of the events that have gone on this week. But this is the first time that the New York Times used a high-resolution satellite as an investigative journalist, which was to go to Grozny in Chechnya in 1999. And then they're showing the before and after image, which is, of course, that's the way satellite images are used objectively. You have to show the before and after, so that you look at the picture, you see the shadows of the building, the buildings over here, and there's no shadows over there, which is supposed to prove that all the buildings have been destroyed. And then on the other hand, just in 2009, when the newest high resolution satellite was launched, now at a resolution of 0.5 meters per pixel, the North Koreans claimed that, Ian Sample in The Guardian claimed that the North Koreans timed the launch of a rocket to coincide with the passing of a satellite, and then publicized that image, right? So I think that's the two sides of what you're asking me. But you have a neologism in your book, which you call para-empiricism, or you talk about you're trying to develop what you call a para-empirical practice, and I think that's related to what you were just pointing out now about how the images are already interpreted in a way. And so I think I wonder if you could just kind of pull that out a little bit about what you mean by not looking at these kinds of images, looking at data, looking at the whole package that these things are a part of. Yeah, so I think, the para-empirical is that oftentimes, so often and still today, science is considered as objective, and and we're supposed to believe facts that come out of science. But there's always an art to interpretation. And so while I was actually doing this research, I often would get on the phone and talk to someone named John Pike, who I know you know very well as well.
He's got a great voice.
He's got a great voice, and he always answers the phone. If anybody wants to know anything about satellite imagery, you just pick up the phone and he's there. And he taught me, very clearly and, over and over again what Colin Powell told to the UN Security Council again, that satellite interpretation is both an art and a science. You have to know what you're looking at. You have to know what you're looking for to be able to recognize it. And he had all these patterns of how many pixels you need to recognize, to recognize imagery. And so that's a very important part of the book, and in fact, a very important part of all the work that I do, because when you're working so much with data, you can't claim that it doesn't have a bias, that it is neutral, that there was no story to collecting it.
So how is this idea of para-empiricism, what kind of methodology or kind of research strategy are you suggesting with this idea then?
That there's art. I mean, it's quite simply, right? That you need art and science, and you need ambiguity to come up with the real reasons why things happen, or what things mean, or is that enough? Yeah,
absolutely.
So.
On the other hand, these are machines taking pictures, and these are machines that have names, and they're machines that have histories. And that's another thing that I thought was very important part of your book is you have a section that's almost like a glossary of satellites and overhead imaging platforms. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why including them, what you learned from looking at just how these machines work and what their specific histories are.
That was a decision that sort of came after the projects to underscore that history, because I think a lot of people, and it's not even a history, it's a glossary, because people don't know the very brief development of satellite technology. So there's GPS, which when I started, I can actually claim the small claim to fame of being the first artist who used, or architect, whatever you want to call it, who used GPS, and especially for drawing as well as.
And we'll come to that project.
We'll come to that. But so GPS, when I started doing this work, was going to be a utility. It was not a utility yet, right? But it
was for the military, but it just wasn't.
No, not even for the military. Wasn't it? No, it was only launched in time for the Gulf War, right? So in the early 90s, it was not yet fully operational.
So it went online as a civilian platform and a military platform
at the same time.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and the same actually for Landsat. Although a lot of people don't talk about it that way. Landsat is the satellite.
So people know what GPS is in general. Why don't you just describe how the system works?
Does anybody not know what GPS is?
But why don't you describe how it
when
works?
I first
how does the constellation work? What are these machines actually doing?
They are very complicated machines. They're very stupid machines as well, because there's 24 satellites which spiral the Earth constantly, and if you have a receiver that can pick up a signal from 4 of the satellites, it can very precisely tell you your position by the time it takes for the signal to reach the satellite and travel back in time. And that's what Peter Gallison makes a big issue about, is that kind of relativity. So that's what GPS does, but functionally all it does is it records 1 dot every second, or every micro.
It transmits a dot or records a dot?
It records a dot on then you get into the secondary part of it, where you have to build an interface to pick up the signals, which then translate it into whatever drawing technology you might have on the screen. So it can draw points, longitude and latitude, or it can direct a missile to a very precise target. It can do that as well. So it's an infrastructure, but now it does both military targeting and telling you with that nice little voice that it has.
Absolutely. But it has several resolutions. There's a military resolution and a civilian resolution. Is that
they
right?
used to be, but they turned that off in 1995 after the whole declassification thing with Clinton, because it became actually so useful as a civilian utility that there might be that you can get much closer with a military resolution, but only through the things that I used to use as a civilian to correct the accuracy by it's called differential correction, where you use two points in relation to each other to correct.
There was a funny moment in the 90s, I think for a moment the military actually classified the orbits of all the GPS satellites, and then all the astronomers got together and all these satellites do is broadcast where they are. So what's the
big deal? But and it's the same Landsat like GPS, I would call.
So what's Landsat?
Landsat is it's a satellite that takes lower resolution pictures, and it records the Earth every 3 days, a complete picture of the Earth. You don't task a Landsat satellite; it just goes around and around and around the globe. And so Landsat has gone from 60...
When was Landsat first? When did that program begin?
It began in the early 70s at the same time as the Blue Marble. It was really, I would say, a response to the picture of the Earth from space and environment, and it was branded as useful to environmentalists and to the military. So at that point, the military had much higher resolution photographs, but it was still very useful to do certain types of surveillance, like for the Gulf War.
And we've seen that even with, ostensibly civilian overhead imaging platforms. We'll see over and over that the primary customer is the military. Well,
then when you start looking at as the technology becomes declassified, this is all very technical. but
I think that's a crucial part of what you're talking about, is understanding these infrastructures.
Yeah, definitely. And so ICONOS and Digital Globe and all the 1 meter resolution satellites, their technology was declassified by Clinton in 1995. But the U.S. government funded them, paid half the money for the launch of these satellites. So with GeoEye, you see the Google sign on the, as the satellite was launched. But Google did actually not provide any money to the satellite, but they have the rights to use the imagery. But the military still has shutter control over any U.S. satellite. But the U.S. also really tries to keep in front of any other country. They try to have the highest resolution satellite available for civilians at any point.
We famously saw the use of that shutter control in the beginning of the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, or I think they actually just bought every image.
Yeah, in fact, they've tried really hard to never use shutter control.
Interesting. So they just buy
that's
the
why
images
they
and say,
buy.
we own it,
Yeah,
can't see it.
right. Because I think if they actually invoked shutter control, they would really get into big trouble worldwide. So they do it in much more devious ways.
To throw money at it.
Right.
Just
throw money at it, or else make agreements with other countries. So I was just at a seminar in London with A.L. Weissman's roundtable, and he's convinced that the clouds over Beirut are intentional by Google. I couldn't answer that question for him, but he was really sure about that.
Why don't we take a look at your Ellsworth Kelly?
Okay. My Ellsworth
Your
Kelly.
Ellsworth Kelly, in terms of... I really love this, kind of coming back to this question of what these sorts of images reveal and conceal, and what's going on with this vantage point. I think this is like a kind of a brilliant way to frame actually a conversation about what these images are. You've made a very abstract work of art, out of satellite imagery, and I think that this piece, really speaks to a lot of the contradictions that your investigation of these sorts of images and platforms
I have to say, actually, I owe this work to Brandon Joseph, sitting there in the audience, because I one time gave a lecture where I think it was at Princeton, where I was showing a whole series of clouded, because satellites can see through clouds.
Yeah.
So during the war in Kosovo, in fact, there were only 2 cloudless days where most of the surveillance imagery was taken. And so I showed a lot of white-on-white images. I didn't realize that was what I was doing, and Brandon came up to me after and said, "Those are white-on-white," you know. And that actually started me thinking about the abstraction of a lot of these images. And then I started, I don't know how it happened, but started thinking about the idea of monochrome landscapes. I think it was because the first image I tried to get was this green one over here, which was an image of the Cameroonian rainforest. And it was at a time where I was actually invited to a show at ZKM. So I decided I was going to do an image of the rainforest. Because no, that's not true. What I was trying to do, I was trying to collaborate with an NGO, or I really wanted to buy a high-resolution image because they were so new at the time. I wanted to buy one for someone who could not afford it. So either a human rights organization, a not-for-profit organization, someone who really wanted to see something.
You wanted to take the money for the commission
and repurpose it, allow it to double function that way. And also because, I could get an image of anywhere on Earth. How was I going to choose? I didn't want to be the one snooping.
Right.
I wanted to have somebody else snoop for me. And so at the time, actually, Human Rights Watch did not want to use these kinds of military images, as opposed to now.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
Yeah, we can come to that later. But so green was with an organization called Global Forest Watch.
And the green was the first one of this.
Yeah.
And when you had that picture taken, you were not thinking about this artwork. You were
I
thinking
wasn't.
About,
I was thinking about
right?
just the ZKM project. But this image took so long to get because there's so many clouds over the rainforest.
Why did you pick that spot?
Because there was an illegal road being built there, which. This is Global Forest Watch, which was in this Landsat picture, which you couldn't see very well.
Gotcha.
And it was illegal in the rainforest because they were still defining concession areas where sustainable forestry was allowed to happen. And so that we indeed did find the illegal road, and
you
then
found it on the image that you took.
Yeah. And then this is how they used it. This is how the Global Forest Watch used it in a court of law to prove that that there was an illegal road, and then they actually converted it into a concession area so that then allowable tree cutting. It was done in the right way rather than just plowing down the rainforest. But so then that turned into this idea of how many monochrome landscapes actually are there in the world, and they're actually not very many, and most of them are in very vulnerable ecological parts of the world. So white happens to be Anwar in Alaska. And gold is one of the first days of the Iraq War. And on the same day that I was looking for images of Iraq, there was an article in the newspaper about Bush wanting to drill for oil in this natural reserve. And then blue is the 00, very abstract point on Earth to which every other digital point in the world is aligned with. And then green was,
So now you've also presented that collection of images as a work of art. So can you talk a little bit about what is this as a work of art? What is this as, investigating logging roads and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
What I like about the piece is it seems to embody these weird contradictions.
Well, that was the point of it. So it was, on the one hand, taking on Ellsworth Kelly. I love Ellsworth Kelly, but he's a formalist, right? But I'm not one of these people who thinks, there's formalism and there's activism. I think that there's there's formalism in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And you can call a lot of the work that I do quite formal, although it's very activist as well, because of the way that it engages with various subject content, or the reasons that I do the projects. But this one was deliberately in the context of a museum, and at the time, museums were the people who were funding my work.
Right.
That's changed a little bit.
And the titles of these images are also interesting too, because they're unbelievably detailed. So we have white on white, and then your titles like longitude and latitude, and here's the spacecraft that took it, and here's the time of day. I mean, that's this unbelievable amount of information that you're trying to provide that's actually not in the image.
It is in the image.
It is in the image.
Yes. And that's that's why I label the images the way I do, is to try and distinguish them from the way that these kinds of images get published in newspapers, right? They get published as images.
Right.
Whereas when you get data from a satellite company on a CD or through the cloud or whatever, if you click on a pixel, it has a longitude, latitude, it has a spectral value, it can have 5 layers, it can have infrared, there's all kinds of things so it's data.
Gotcha.
Right, but it's image data. And once you disassociate the data from the image, that's when the trouble, that's when I think you can be lied to, if you're so inclined. Yeah, if you want to talk about it that way.
So moving along, I mean, I really like this image as a way of kind of framing some of the other ways in which you've combined these sorts of images and platforms to do projects that are, on one hand, have a kind of activist angle to them as well as a kind of aesthetic angle to them. Let's look at some of the early work you were doing with the GPS.
Okay.
And
how's this going? Okay. Okay. So this was one of the very first projects I ever did, which was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona. So it was in fact I traveled through an airport with a GPS receiver,
what year was this?
That was 1994.
Okay.
So there was no way that I could do that now. It was a military GPS receiver. So when it went through an X-ray, it just looked black. You couldn't even see what it was, and nobody stopped me. It was amazing. So then I got to Barcelona and walked on the roof of the Richard Meier Museum. But really all the GPS receiver does, as I told you before, it records one dot, and this was at a time where the receiver was still scrambled. So this was a point I stood on for 5 minutes and then corrected it against a base point someplace far away in the mountain, which then creates an average point, and I then, traced the letters of the word museo on the... So the project was at one and the same time trying to understand the architecture of the mapping system, but on the other hand, the military nature and the inaccuracy of something which was supposed to be the most accurate means of locating things.
And you have a project that's in the same vein too that you did with the storefront for art and architecture,
in fact,
right?
the storefront was the first place. I don't have actually any images of that, but that was the first. I did that a year before, actually. So I did that in 1994 as just like 6 months after the technology was fully operational.
When I first saw these projects, I kind of thought about them in relation to that kind of situationist derive, or like the idea of trying to, using the map of Brussels to navigate Paris. And did you think about that kind of work in that tradition at all, or not?
At the time, I really didn't, because I was so concerned with trying to define what a point is when it's at once, standing on it and at infinity. So it wasn't a time where... But I think that the people who do this work now, and it's called locative media, and the artists who do this kind of work, that's what they do with it. But I left it behind after I understood it as an infrastructure and as an architectural system. I was done with it. I didn't really want to keep using it as an expressionistic drawing tool.
Right.
Although I think some of the work that's done with that is amazing, but
Right.
and you know, I think now GPS is also used in combination with smartphones, and there's all kinds of things you can do, and there's people, you know, constantly, you know, tracking their regular pathways. I find it very boring because it just okay, so I go to school and to work.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
you know,
Well, that was the point of that old situations map.
Yeah,
Too, right?
yeah. So.
But you know, on a more kind of serious side, you have projects that, you know, are really trying to use this kind of data, these kinds of images to do really, you know, to do real political work with, right? Why don't we? Let's look at one that you. I mean, do you want to look at the South Africa project, for example? Or do you want
I think the Kosovo. Well, although there's this incredible map of Africa, which was made by the very first high resolution surveillance satellites, which were rolls of film, not even satellite imagery, and I really want to find these pieces or try and reconstruct it. Someone has to reconstruct this image. But, you know, I think the most political project I might have done at the time was the Kosovo project.
Why don't we look at that a little bit more? You know, I mean, was there? So tell us just about what the project was, because it's against the background of the emergence of satellite imagery in reporting.
Right.
The emergence of these kinds of images in not only reporting, but the popular consciousness as well.
Well, these images were published on the NATO website. So it was the first time that the U.S. actually published that images of this high resolution were even in existence at all. And so this image was in the New York Times, and it showed, you know, again, before and after evidence of mass graves, and then the so-called evidence of the upturning of the mass graves, of the, you know, getting rid of those bodies and hiding them from the rest of the world, right? And it became one of the Time magazine's photo of the century in 1999. But at the time, there were no high-resolution satellites in orbit that a civilian could that a civilian could purchase, and there was no data in this image, right?
Right.
This is an image, so if you
there's no
zoom,
metadata,
there's no
it's not telling
metadata.
you,
It doesn't tell you longitude and latitude. It just says the 2 dates.
Right.
And so I became obsessed with reinstating the data into the image. That's all I wanted to do. It was very abstract. I had no mission of, you know, deciding whether these things were true or not, or, you know, that was not the mission. The mission was just to simply reinstate the data into the image and to see if I could find something that looked similar, right? And so I purchased a spot image, which was, this is a French satellite, and it was the highest resolution at the time of commercial satellite imagery. And I got so a spot color image, which was 20 kilometers per pixel, and a spot black and white image, which was 10 meters per pixel. And then then using this German drone image, you know, and again following John Pike's suggestion that you have to know what you're looking for to recognize it in an image. So here's the drone image, and here's the 10-meter resolution spot image, and I became convinced that looked pretty good. There was a road, and here were these pixels to the side of the road where the mass grave was. And so that's the same pixels, 10 meters. And then here's the original military one. And so then I just put it into Photoshop, and I turned tons and tons more images into it. But it's the same longitude and latitude as the drone image, and there was also lots of video on the web that, you know, that pinpointed the location, and I became convinced that that was the same piece of Earth, and I called it a digital memorial.
Did you, through that process of trying to like refine the data and put it back into the images? Were there
Yeah.
really anything that was surprising or that you really learned by doing that?
Well, you learn how blurry it all is,
Right.
right? Because, as I said, I think that's the road. So it had the same longitude and latitude. I can tell you that. So
Now let's go back to this
Yeah.
question you mentioned before about how Human Rights Watch didn't want to use these kinds of images at that moment. I want to talk a little bit about that and kind of talk about whether or not some of these methodologies and techniques, how they're being used now by people like who are doing
Right.
human rights work. So what was the problem with human rights work? Why didn't they want to collaborate with you on the ZKM?
Yeah, they
project, for
thought
example?
that the imagery was too militaristic. They
Uh-huh.
didn't want to use the same methods as the military. They changed their mind very soon afterwards, and now a lot of human rights organizations are using satellite imagery, and so and in fact, people like, where is that image? Like George Clooney at Harvard has started a group called Satellite Sentinel, where they're in fact looking, where they're trying to call attention to what they're defining as human rights violations, or looking for evidence and trying to make the world aware of things that are going on. There's also the project of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Committee on Conscience.
I don't know what that is.
They partnered with Google Earth
Uh-huh.
and put lots of little fires on the Google Earth map and gave high resolution imagery to Google Earth, and call it a sort of a genocide watch, that they're looking for evidence of villages being burned and people being moved and things like that. So, but I think that these images, particularly the Holocaust Memorial Museum, are used in such a rhetorical way that it's in some ways just like the military. They're telling you what you're looking at without giving you any more data about it. They might, they don't tell you the date of the image. They don't tell you. There's just so many ways that they leave the imagery murky and ambiguous. And so I do worry about things like that. Although I still do think that there's incredible power of using imagery like this to investigate things. So.
And it seems like in a project like $1 Million Blocks, like if we want to look at that one, I mean, you're really going all out with that one in terms of trying to put some of these techniques to work.
Use,
Do you want to talk us
Yeah.
through that project a
Well,
little bit?
it's funny because that project has nothing to do with satellite imagery. So, but it's the last project in the book, and it's an example of using GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, and GIS had to be the way that project was presented, because it was so much about an updatable database, which I somehow think of like the icon of the project. Like I wouldn't always choose to use GIS as a way of communicating about a project, but because of the way that it was about, rather than showing where a crime was committed.
So what's the project? Just
what's the
just
project?
give us the overview of.
So the project was actually the first project of the Spatial Information Design Lab, and it was a collaboration between a criminal justice activist and the labs. And so Eric Cadora had a whole lot of data which he had gotten from the courts. It's not publicly accessible data. It's very hard data to get. And it's data that tracks people through the prison system as they're released.
So it's data that says, for example, this person was arrested here, they were processed here, they were shipped over here.
No, it says this person committed a crime, and they've been incarcerated for 3 years.
Okay.
This is their home address, and it doesn't say this is where aren't they in prison. It just says this is their home address.
Okay.
And so instead of, and you know how prevalent crime maps are, right? And
Yeah,
especially
sure.
in data visualization, you go to any conference on data visualization, and the most things they show are crime maps and airplanes flying across the country. I don't know why, but I will never do an airplane visualization, that I can tell you, nor a crime map. So this project is in opposition. It's in opposition to that, and it takes the home address of a person, and because you have a home address, you can, every time you have an address, you can put a point on the map, and then once you have that point, you can correlate it.
So what we're seeing now is these points on the map correspond to people who are incarcerated.
People who are incarcerated, and this is what they write down as their home address as they are incarcerated, right? And so then when you correlate that information with other political boundaries, in this case census blocks, which became the sort of the motif of the project, what you see over here are the bright red dots mean high incidence of incarceration or high concentrations of incarcerated people. And so when you compare that with geographies of poverty and race, there's a high correlation again. So this is people of color, this is people living below the poverty line, and this is people who are incarcerated. And then to sort of up the ante on the rhetoric of the project, we provided a cost. We added another column to the data set and said this is how much it costs to incarcerate somebody for a year, and it's $30,000 a year in New York, and so that's how much it costs to incarcerate everybody in Brooklyn that year.
So in terms of this project, what do you think you get out of doing it this way? In other words, to kind of bring it back to the original question, what does this vantage point provide you with that is unique to this vantage point, and what kinds of work does it allow you to do? Well, this particular project, it allowed you, and I'm not sure that this is answering your question correctly, but this allowed you to show the cost of incarceration and to show where the money goes. So instead of going to poor parts of the city, it's going to upstate New York to keep small towns going. But it also, it started off as for me, a very rhetorical project, one that asked questions about why is the United States the place in the world with the highest incarceration rates. It asked questions of how to communicate in effective ways that, these masses and masses of just numbers. It tried to navigate people to certain places on the map, particularly policymakers or any part of the public who happen to see the image and doesn't live there, because these are facts that are very well known to people who live in these neighborhoods, but they're not self-evident to anybody else. And so the map was used as a rhetorical device to make these things clear, because maps are, in the same way that maps are arguments. Absolutely.
And they were very consciously arguments. There was nothing objective about this map. It wasn't there to tell you the truth. It was there to tell a story.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's, I think, often the way that I like to use maths. I don't pretend for a minute that they're objective or,
Right.
or scientific, but it doesn't mean they don't tell you important things. So,
Absolutely. And I think
So-
one of the things that was really compelling to me is that it's very relational in a way. It's talking, I mean, you're using this vantage point from overhead to actually show me something about the relationship between certain city blocks and places out,
Yeah.
you know, in the middle of
Yeah.
goodness knows where.
Right.
And
But what
showing
I
how
like-
those spaces
yeah.
are folded into each other and
Yeah.
how the economics are folded
Right.
into each other.
A lot of people tell me that my work is very flat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true, you know, it all looks very two-dimensional. But I've started developing an argument about multi-dimensional space, because actually multi-dimensional space is very hard to draw.
Yeah, sure.
And in fact, the best way to draw multi-dimensional space is flat. And a lot of people, and it's actually even a lot of scientists that I've been interviewing lately come to the same conclusion. So, I mean, I'm starting to wonder whether that's true. You know, maybe there is a better way to communicate multi-dimensional space. So, multi-dimensional means time. The x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis, and time is the fourth dimension, but there's many, many other dimensions which make a point more specific. And a point, I mean a literal point in space. So in this case, you know, there's income, there's demographics, there's, right? These are all dimensional, they're dimensional qualities. And in science, there's a whole slew of those things.
So before we go into questions, I want to just talk a little bit about where do you see this stuff going, right? If we kind of agree with historians like Benjamin Lazier or whatever, who says that we're living in this moment of this Earthrise moment where maps have become a very part of our everyday lives, been kind of we use them to think, we use them to navigate, these are completely ubiquitous. Where do you see these technologies going? Just first of all, in terms of whatever their military, commercial, you know, activist, whatever kind of implications, and then as a follow-up to that, what do you see as the kind of uncapitalized on opportunities to put this world to work? You know, I'm sure you've ran into all sorts of things looking at this where you thought, oh, it'd be such a great idea if someone did X or Z or Y or whatever.
Right.
So maybe we just talk a little about the future of this kind of seeing and these machines and infrastructure.
Okay. Well, I think the future is wide open. It really is wide open, and mainly because of the incredible flip that's happened. You know, when I first started doing this work, I was doing GPS, and everybody else was looking at the World Wide Web, and you know, cyberspace was something that was inside of the computer, and the utopia was always very much embedded and very deep inside the computer. Now, I think with cell phones and smartphones and all, a lot of the virtualized world is directing you to the physical world, whereas the physical world used to direct you deep inside the computer. Now it's the complete opposite, and that is wide open for consumption, and it's something we have to be really careful. We have to be really careful of. So
how so?
Well, you know, I think the web used to be a utopian space, and it's now quite corporate. So we have to think about that in terms of Facebook and Google and Foursquare, and where the way we use it is we don't even know that we're being watched, but you know, advertising is directed at us, that kind of thing. You know, but on the other hand, big data can tell us big things that are still unknown about the world, and we shouldn't forget that big data means Facebook and Google and and all the hundreds of baby photos that we upload, you know, every day. So I think it's you know, I'm actually interested in big data and small data, and I think
what's small data?
Small data is, you know, going online every day and you know, just the things that you need to do with data versus what's coming at you from the other direction and is being taken from you, and when you don't know that it's being taken from you and it belongs to you. And I think that there's an incredible dialogue that needs to happen between big data and small data, so that we can understand big patterns. And we need to understand patterns that come out of data, but at the same time we need to be careful because I think now image analysis is often constructed by algorithms,
Right.
and algorithms which are written by humans,
Right.
but there's a vicious circle going on. So, I'm, and in some ways I've left the satellite imagery per se behind, and I'm doing different kinds of work nowadays. But mapping is at the base of, it's really at the base of it. It's just that the materials for producing these things keep changing, and I try to stay up to date. It's not always easy, but I try.
If you had an unlimited budget and the best graduate students in the world who would do whatever you told them to do, is there any kind of dream projects where you think, I would really like to be able to do this? I'm interested in turning the telescope the other way lately. Because there's people looking for other universes nowadays, but if you put a telescope, when you look at a telescope, the things that you see are hundreds and thousands of years old. Yeah. And I'm becoming interested in that problem of how you get beyond that. Can you get beyond that? No, I'm not sure, but anyway, there's lots of other projects I'm doing though. So maybe on that note, we could, when we're thinking about all other universes.
Yeah, but I think you should tell at least a couple of projects that you're working on right now.
I think we don't have a lot of time left, and we want to give people in the audience a chance to.
Okay, questions? Yeah. Yeah.
We want you to ask.
I can't help it. It's training or something. But I'm thinking of the Human Genome Project, which was a kind of mapping human genetic history and structure, and how at the end of that project, the scientists who had done it were faced with something they absolutely didn't understand at all, and they understood only a fraction of it. And I was wondering if there was a moment in your work where you've come across something that sort of was everything, you knew everything about what you were doing as you were going in and structuring it and gathering the data and structuring the data in a certain way and progressing through it, and even some of the operation of an artistic sensibility in there. But you ended up with something that was incomprehensible in some way, or partially incomprehensible, or whether it arrayed itself in a completely unpredictable way suddenly, and if it just left you sort of speechless or something, that you couldn't do anything further with it. Because we tend to think of information as being, even if it's distorted by social political stuff, that it nevertheless it itself is somehow penetrable always, or able to be assembled or aggregated in intelligible ways. So it's just, is the information also have, or the data also have the ability to compile itself in a way that is completely incomprehensible, or it shows up the complete idiocy of the initial question, in a sense, about the human genome?
That's a good question. I'd add, well, not in my experience. I deal with quite simple things, really, so I don't. But nobody knows how the human brain works, and so I've started doing a little bit of work on that. And so the new project, not about the new human genome, is now the brain project that Obama has just funded, and Columbia is part of that. So that might get me stuck, I would imagine, like it gets lots of the scientists stuck too. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other candidates, like other words one could use? Like
Then image?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's I really struggled with that in the book because I coined the term image data, you know, or map or chart. I don't know. It's there's lots of types of images, but it still gets you stuck. And I'm still stuck on that word. How to make all those different distinctions. Yeah, it is. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
What do they talk about in the, among intelligence analysts and people like that? Do they call this stuff images, or do they call it product, right? Isn't that one of the words?
Well,
that
they have
use?
a range of words that they use. So they, no, they use imagery. They often use imagery. This imagery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking through what I saw in your presentation is the kind of symmetry between the early work and the latter work, and that in the early work you begin with satellite imagery and you kind of you interpret and extract kind of data or significance out of that, and then in this work you start with abstract data and then you generate an image, and so the image kind of bookmarks how you how you sort of interpret and produce the work. But in the data-driven work where you create the map at the end, it seems like what's very different is that at the beginning you start with a satellite image which is very controlled in a certain way. It's like it's a single source. But in this work, it's data, the sources of which are multiplying exponentially all
Right.
the time. And so it seems like it's a very, very different project and a very, very different problem of interpretation, because again, it's about how to visualize something that's not visual and then extract meaning out of that. So it also means, though, that you rely on the data being accurate. And I just wonder if you think that the increasing amount of data and the increasing sources of data start to run the risk of really distorting the accuracy of that, which in turn distorts the maps that come out of it. In other words, does it get more dangerous as data increases?
Yeah.
The ability, or
No, I think the first half of your question is really great, right? Because I'm much more I see much more potential in all of the data that can be transformed into, I don't know what we want to call them, but new images or all kinds of visualizations which open up new questions and new spaces, which you can probe further. But the accuracy thing, data is not about accuracy. Data is just about collection. Data is about translation of one thing into another. So I don't aim for, data doesn't often aim for accuracy. So that part of the question I don't quite understand, or it's not part of the project that I'm interested in. It's true that you need reliable data sources, but not accurate ones. So for example, I was at a lecture I was at a conference in Rhode Island. It was called Habits of Living, and there was someone who was trying to ascertain the validity of a Syrian news report. And, so they were just really confused about how to go about deciding whether it was true or not true, right? So there's all kinds of ways that you can validate. You can validate a source by making connections between it and how it arrived into a, how you got to see it and all of that. There's ways of validating things, but it's not about whether the one is accurate or not. I don't know if it makes any sense.
There's a question about your other modes here at GSAPP, because we see some of the lab work, but then there's also been all the years you've been working on CBIP with Scott and David and now Jeanette, but also all the years that you've been running the visual studies courses, and particularly now that you've done this new course on representation with Reinhold's lecture and then the series of workshops that you've been doing. Any revelations on those other modes that impact this body of work?
It's all connected. It's a system. I wear many hats at the school, and I'm not one of those teachers who only teaches what I do. I have a lot of different modes, and so this new work, I think, is taking the data visualization stuff, is taking me off into very different directions, because it really demands new collaborations, which I think is also part of CBIP as well. Like the way that we teach together is very much depending on each other's expertise and things like that. But also when you do work with data, you really have to rely on people who know how to process it. And I'm not a data processor or a statistician, but I know how to ask questions about data, and I know a lot about data, and I don't know if you would say the same thing, David, with the work we're doing. With the work we're doing now, it's impossible to know everything, in that sense. And so the structure of collaboration becomes very important in all of these projects. Yeah.
So I guess my question is more political than artistic or technical, but when somebody back here was asking about the danger of too much data. So in watching Boston this last week, one of the things that I found really scary was how much data and information, it's like a police state, that the government can so quickly collect, interpret, etc. So I just wondered if you wanted to elaborate more on, you said something about like the technologies there, we have to use it, but what choices do we have? What do we decide to do or not to do? Is it going to be a threat in a way to being human? Whatever that is.
Yeah. No, I do. I think it's an important question. Part of the surprise of the Boston thing was not that they caught you knew that they were going to. You're right. You knew that they were going to piece it all together quite quickly and find the people. I think I had that belief, but the worst part was all the other stories that flew around by the crowd, which was given by the crowd, by the crowd who were trying to join the police, and I think that's something we have to be trained not to do, because that had quite big impacts as well when the wrong people were accused. But I do think we've gone into a time where we expect that there's cameras everywhere, and and data, that's trackable, and we have to be cautious. We have to be cautious about that. I don't know how we can be cautious about that, but there's data that opens up important questions, and there's data that shuts down freedom and shuts down important questions. And we should also be allowed to delete data. We should have choices of whether data is saved or deleted. I think there's a whole series of questions that are unanswered about that, and that because it's all happened so quickly, that have not yet been answered by policymakers or privacy experts, things like that. Universities, governments, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In the current political discourse, are there any instances of data imagery that stand out in your mind as being egregiously biased?
In what discourse?
In current political discourse.
Oh, tons.
Any that stand out as very egregious?
Crime maps, homeland security, racial profiling, all kinds of things. Stop and frisk. Yeah.
In terms of this world of satellite imagery, I think one of the canonical examples you talk about, of course, is the build-up to the Iraq War. Colin Powell going before the UN and said, "These are this and this is this," and basically using the ambiguity of these images, capitalizing on that in order to advocate for a war based on stuff that really wasn't there.
Yeah.
But in terms of more recent uses of satellite imagery, I'm wondering if there's something as kind of poignant as that. And I haven't been looking at this, but I wonder if there's something.
No, I think it's interesting because I don't think it would be satellite imagery right now. I'm trying to think of an example, maybe North Korea.
Maybe IP addresses or something
I
like
think
that.
it's more like IP addresses, and I think maybe censorship in China. I think there's other. I don't think it's satellite imagery anymore, which is where the big secrets are held.
Interesting.
Don't you agree with that? I don't know. Yeah. Dan, he's been asking, has his hand up for a while. Yeah. Student. Oh, you're next, okay? No, he can go next, yeah.
Right. Well, actually, on that point, maybe something that has to do with how this image is different from a lot of the others, because this image, in contradistinction to the maps, which are more or less true, and the aerial photographs or satellite images, which are more or less true and more or less evidentiary, this is, as much as anything, an argument against itself. This is a map that says this should be different. And it sort of argues by ellipsis that something should be done about that. It opens up that space. And maybe one of the fun ones to think about is a counterexample to the surveillance to privacy question might be electoral districts, right? Because there's a small number of people who are really, really good at working those maps from evidence to a project.
Yeah.
And it would be a very interesting thing for that information to be much more openly available, A, than it is, and or much more broadly used to open up a big argument about where those lines should be and why. Especially as, you get urbanization distorting things, just naturally, and then the business of what people are or could be doing on purpose.
Yeah, it's not a question, right? I agree. I completely agree with that. I agree with that. Electoral districts are hugely problematic and should be more. We should fight about them more. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Laura. I had a question about
the last question. Yeah.
Source.
Okay.
The source of data, or where it comes from, and I guess the kind of structure that's already built into having a good source? Because I guess this data set, you mentioned that you got from someone, but it's like really successful because there's like, it seems like there's a really big sample size and there's like a homogeneity to of who is, you know, actually getting the data. And, you know, so it's like on one hand, you need the kind of large institution, I'm assuming of the prison network or the government, to do this kind of, you know, very kind of vast and thus consistent data collection. And the same thing goes for the satellite, where you already need like someone who has shot up a satellite into space. So you're like, one already has to work with the existing infrastructure of some system to then borrow their imagery and then use the data to make a statement. So I'm wondering, like, how do you work with like this kind of, not contradiction, but if one wants good data, you have to work with an institution or a large entity that has enough resources to gather good data. But on the other hand, you know, the actions or the statements that one might make might go counter to that. So that, you know, like, how do you work with large institutions, or how does the question of the source that comes from the institution already colored or kind of tinged for you?
Right. Well, it's a really good question, and the source. In the case of these, what I'm really trying to draw out in the book is that they're not neutral. So the way the data is gathered and the machines and the financing and all of that of the data is not neutral in its to what it is. But on the other hand, nowadays, you know, you as you know, and I know that you know this, can scrape. You know, you can scrape data, and when data is open source, there's all kinds of other things that you can do with it, which is very different to, you know, to the kind of work that I'm doing in the book. And so, but that, you know, that data has to be, you know, you then have to format it in ways that can be useful, and there's all kinds of things that you have to do to it, and that is also not neutral to the process of how you interpret it. So, you know, there's always that built into an image, to a piece of visualization, which I think that's fine, as long as you make it clear that that's what you're doing with it. Okay, thank you. Okay. Thanks for your generous questions. Okay.